First of all, thanks to Catherine and the team for inviting me to speak to you today. And I'd start by saying, very interesting coming from a practical agronomic field background to hear some of the very high-level science that's going on behind the scenes with some of these projects, even if some of it was a bit over my head, but very interesting nonetheless. So Catherine asked me to cover how some of the science that happens here and in other places affects on-farm decision-making. So I was just going to quickly, just a little bit of background about myself. Then talk about decision-making on farm, what drives decision-making in an arable, combinable crop situation. Managing disease, a lot of it will be duplication of what's already been discussed, so I won't dwell on that too much. I'm going to focus on yellow rust purely because of its significance on farm and its significance within the UKCPVS. And then go on to talk about that and how that works from a on-farm point of view. How some of the work that Agrii R&D data collection and the trials happening locally to me sort of complements what's happening here. And then just some final thoughts from me really about what's going on and also where it might be going in the future. So yeah, I've worked as an agronomist now for the best part of 15 years. I started in 2011 after I graduated from Harper Adams. I've always worked in the sort of central southern part of England, so from the sort of Somerset, Dorset border across Dorset into Hampshire and up into sort of southern part of Wiltshire as far as the plains. I work mainly with arable combinable crops. That does include forage crops for livestock and AD. I do also get involved with some fruit and veg, but it's a minimal part, and some amenity as well, but it's a much smaller part of what I do. I'm involved locally with a lot of replicated trials. Some of those are through Agrii and others are through trials contractors like OAT looking for sites for manufacturers or breeders. And also some on-farm trials that are non-replicated, so non-scientific, larger sort of field-scale tramline trials where I've got interested clients that like to be trialling new things on farm, whether that might be an establishment system, that might be a mix of varieties, or it could be some sort of biological input they're particularly interested in. And nationally within Agrii, I provide a technical support function for regenerative farming techniques and systems. So what drives on-farm decision-making? So unsurprisingly, they're businesses at the end of the day, so the vast majority are driven by profitability. So the gross margin of a crop per hectare, but more importantly, the gross margin across the rotation. And there's always this desire to try and get to the lowest cost per tonne of production. So there's a whole multitude of factors obviously affecting that. Their farming system has a big impact on that, especially the establishment system, which is becoming, I'd say, more of a feature of what happens on farm now as the growth in reduced tillage gathers momentum. Agronomics, quite clearly, and I could have listed loads and loads of different points here, but trying to just highlight some of the key ones. Obviously, grass weeds, particularly prominent in the part of the country we sit in, but not exclusive to East Anglia by any means. The growth of Italian ryegrass in recent years has been quite staggering as well, and so it's no longer just black grass that's driving some of that decision making. And then a rotational point of view which links on to first wheat. So for most farming businesses that I work with and combinable crop-based farming businesses, it's all about first wheat performance. Although gross margin performance of break crops is obviously really important, it's really difficult to consistently achieve the same levels of gross margin performance in those. So it's all about trying to get that good entry into first wheat. Where that's not the case is where there are other higher value crops in the rotation, so things like veg or potatoes and sugar beet. But in the geography I work within, we have these lovely things called Dorset diamonds, or better known as flints, which mean that our rotation is somewhat restricted from growing any of those higher value crops. So when we're thinking about first wheats, obviously then we move on to trying to choose variety. And again, there's a whole different plethora of agronomic factors that are affecting this decision. So starting generally with rotational position and drilling dates, so the crop that precedes that crop of wheat is going to have a massive influence on the drilling date of that particular crop. So that's going to influence our variety choice. So we know that some of the varieties perform much better in an earlier drilled scenario than they do in a late, and vice versa is also true. The market, as always, will drive decision making in a massive way, and it's sometimes remarkable how much of an impact it can have. If I went back to the incarnation of the varieties Crusoe and Skyfall, which captured the imagination of a lot of farmers in our geography, milling premiums at that stage were sort of £10 to £15 a tonne, so they were reasonable, nothing ridiculously exciting. But the fact that the agronomics from a sectorial point of view were so strong on Crusoe and Skyfall compared with what was in the Group 4 market, there was a massive swing into Group 1 varieties at that stage. And it lasted for quite a while, and for at least 3 or 4 years, from the area I cover, it represented nearly 95% of my wheat acreage, which was quite extraordinary, considering that some of those farms had traditionally not been milling wheat growers. Then a chain of events locally and nationally changed that. So the mill locally to us at Southampton was bought out and then quite quickly closed down. And milling wheat was generally having to be shipped up to Avonmouth or Manchester. And that combined with lower premiums because the market was awash with Skyfall and Crusoe meant that a lot of people then decided to move away from those particular varieties. And also Group 4 varieties with better septoral resistance had started to come through. So we saw a massive reduction and moved to a stage where probably perhaps 30 to 40% were Crusoe and Skyfall. Interestingly, in the last 2 years, so since autumn 22, there's been sort of a renaissance of both varieties as the feed base has stayed relatively low and the milling premium has shot up, with some growers for full spec milling wheat achieving north of £50 a tonne this year. So it's really interesting how the dynamics have just moved so much by the market. Soil types can have a big impact, and it'll have an impact on many things. It's going to have an impact on that window for drilling. It's also going to have an impact on the grassweed pressure and how long that's been present on that farm. It's quite often can be linked to soil type. The establishment system I've already mentioned, but it's going to affect not just the rotation and profitability, it will also influence variety choice. I'll come back to that later on. Yield and quality. So always farmers are going to look at yield, and I think when I first started doing this job, when I'd sit down with growers and we discuss variety choices and cropping for the following year, I think yield sat more at the top. Yield was king. We'll start with the highest yielding varieties and sort of work back from there when we're trying to choose our varieties. But that view's definitely altered, and there's much more interest now around trying to choose varieties based upon their disease resistance. And I've not left that last because it's the least important. It's left last because it links nicely on. And so on to disease resistance, and I've ranked them purely based upon the prevalence and the issues they cause on farm in my geography. And Septoria, I've left it at number 1, but you could have made the case, if this presentation was happening a year ago, that actually yellow rust could be sitting at the top, bizarrely, even though being out of East Anglia in so-called the wetter west, because with the change in climate we've experienced in the 4 to 5 springs prior to the 23 spring, Septoria was much less of a feature, and we'd gone from a situation of rarely seeing yellow rust in my part of the world to regularly seeing yellow rust every spring, and in lots of varieties we weren't necessarily expecting to see it either. I've put brown rust, eye spot and fusarium third, simply because they're so variable in their appearance in terms of the situation they turn up in. They're quite variety specific often, and with regards to fusarium, there's obviously a greater concern around milling wheats than there is feed wheats. The eye spot one I think is actually quite an interesting one, because it seems to me that there has been a gradual decline in the resistance of newer material coming to the market when it's regards to eye spot. And I think it's probably sneaking under the radar a little bit, the damage being done to eye spot in some of these seasons. So yellow rust, as I said, I think it's an increasing concern actually, an increasing threat outside of this geography. And why has that happened? Well, quite obviously climate change must be playing a role. Whether the spring of 23 is a one-off and we're going to now return to very dry springs, and who can say, but if we are going to return to that pattern of very dry springs, then I think we're going to see more yellow rust for sure. Delayed drilling because of grassweed, so generally on farm anything that leads to a big delay in drilling means a reduction in septoria pressure, which is marvellous, but often an increased threat from yellow rust. And obviously in this geography, delaying drilling for grassweeds has been something as a cultural method that's been relied upon for a long time. But again, it's something that increases to be an important tool elsewhere as herbicide resistance becomes a greater issue in grass weed control. In my geography, which there is a lot of livestock in my geography, historically there's been a lot of maize grown for feeding livestock, but I'd say probably in the last 5 years, again linked to what's happened with the climate, there's actually been a reduction in maize being planted purely because it's been very difficult when we've had a very, very dry spring to drill a crop of maize in late April, May, have no rain for 6 weeks and then expect to be harvesting something sensible at the end of September. So to de-risk farming systems, a lot of people have tried to move to either spring whole crop cereals or winter whole crop cereals to give them a bit more reliability, even though it doesn't provide the same quality of feed to cattle. Having said that, the growth and the continued increase in the number of AD plants locally and nationally, I think is increasing the maize acreage overall. So it's significant because generally speaking, there are exceptions to the rule like last year, but generally when maize is being put in the rotation, we're seeing wheats being planted much later. Failed oilseed rape and removal from the rotation, so again, it's probably slightly more extreme in this geography than it is in my geography. Oilseed rape is still a major part of the rotation in sort of the central south of England, although we see many situations where crops, because of cabbage stem flea beetle, are written off and replaced with something else, which generally again means a later drilled wheat is planted. Where it's been removed from the rotation, people are obviously looking for other break crops to tick that box. And it's made it difficult because of the inconsistency of performance of those break crops and the lack of options that are available to us in our part of the world. So people have tried to extend rotations using things like second wheats, and even where oilseed rape is still being grown, traditionally we would have been a wheat, spring barley, oilseed rape 3-year rotation, but clearly we've run into lots of problems with that, so second wheats have become more common. And I think that's significant again because second wheats, probably the two most popular in my geography easily would be Zion and Skyfall. Again, going back to the point around eye spot resistance, there's not that many wheats that seem to perform really well consistently in a second wheat scenario, and the ones that do tend to be those that have that PCH1 eye spot resistance gene. But of course, Zion and Skyfall, I think, are number 1 and number 2 on the RL list currently for weakness to yellow rust. The increase in growers choosing not to use an insecticide, so I work with quite a few growers that have moved to a sort of a regenerative farming system. Some moved quite a long time ago before it was so fashionable in the press to be talking about it. I've got some now that are in 12 years of no-till and moved away from using insecticides. I think that process will now speed up because of the SFI payment available, the £45 a hectare for not applying an insecticide. So I think we're going to see more people choosing not to use insecticides across the entire rotation. And although with no-till generally we're looking to try and drill earlier, certainly where I am, the threat from aphid vectors for BYDV is high, and one of the key tools for reducing that is going to be delaying drilling again. So we'll be interested to see how that develops. So managing disease more generally, it's the challenge of trying to balance multiple agronomic concerns. In the past, our focus has always been around septoria, so it's fitted in quite nicely. Delay your drilling with septoria. It's also going to help with grass weeds. It's a win-win. But under the radar, gradually, I think yellow rust is becoming more of an issue because of that delayed drilling, and the weather's not helping with that. Workload, and it's often discussed at farmer meetings. We talk about trying to manage different problems on farm. It's ridiculous to think for most growers that they can drill in that optimal 10 days, and trying to actually identify where that optimal drilling spell to try and get the best of all worlds is, because it varies so much our climate at the moment. Lots of people will want to drill earlier because generally the conditions are so much better when you drill earlier. The chances of you establishing a crop that roots and tillers effectively and then actually produces a decent yield at the end are much higher. If you look at just the last 2 autumns as a comparison, or even the last 2 years as a comparison, it's ridiculous. It's worlds apart. It makes it so difficult for us and farmers to plan what's going to happen. Last year we had the wettest year on record for most of my guys. We recorded in excess of 1,200 mils of rain. It was wet all year apart from a month between May and June. So when it came to the autumn, farmers just were looking to get crops in the ground. Everything in terms of clever thinking around what was the right thing to do culturally was almost out the window. It was a case of let's try and drill where we can and get what we can in. And in a lot of cases, a lot of people were not able to get in the acreage they wanted. The plus side of it is because of all the moisture we had excellent chits of grass weeds and volunteers, which we'd not seen for many, many autumns. So it was really helpful from a weed management point of view. If you go back to 22, I could say virtually the opposite about all of that. It was so dry, it was the driest year for most people recorded for generations. To the point the ground was so hard, it got through to the early part of September and people were struggling to get drills in the ground. The coulter pressure just wasn't there in a direct drill scenario. And we had, once again, which we'd experienced for a few years in a row, no real chit of black grass or ryegrass or any problematic grass weeds again. So when there was a little bit of moisture available to soften the ground so people could get crops in that 22 autumn, once again, they went ahead and did it. And there, I think in the back of a lot of farmers' mind as well was also the concern that once it does start raining, it's probably not going to stop. And it got into the sort of 10th, 15th of October, and that was exactly what happened. It rained and it kept raining. And we once again reached a situation where people hadn't drilled what they wanted to drill in a lot of cases. So managing yellow rust specifically, because I'm focused on yellow rust, the rotation. So we're trying to try and fit the first wheat into a situation where it's going to go into good conditions earlier rather than end up being put into difficult conditions later and end up with a poor root situation where it's going to be very more vulnerable in the spring to stress conditions, making the disease worse. Trying to remove volunteers, if it's in a second wheat scenario in particular, we don't want a pool of disease already there, especially if it's no-till for the disease to start moving across to the new crop. Obviously selecting resistant varieties, and I put varieties rather than variety because regardless of the acreage, I think it's important for growers to de-risk the situation by trying to have a range of different varieties with a range of different parentage on farm. Many of you will probably remember Reflection and Torch varieties that appeared on the list with very high yields and broke down to yellow rust very quickly with large acreages in the ground for some of those growers involved, and that was not a good place to be in. Some not good conversations around that when that happened. The conversation around blends is very interesting, and it continues to be interesting. We're probably in, locally to me, 5 years worth of plot data now, and I think the best way to describe it is variable still. I think what we generally tend to see overall is that the more resistant varieties to yellow rust when mixed with the varieties with less resistance tend to carry more disease. And from a yield point of view, it usually means the yield is similar or slightly below the highest yielding individual constituent parts. So I would say at the moment, although there are some trials that show an improvement, generally the data is quite mixed, and I wouldn't necessarily advise it as being currently a really successful tool for managing that. But it's definitely something that's still interesting, and we continue to look at it, and we'll continue to look at it nationally in plot trials and locally this year. Crop nutrition is really important. So obviously trying to keep a healthy crop is going to be less susceptible to any disease regardless of what that is. And obviously there's a well-documented link now between nitrogen availability, especially early on in the crop, and yellow rust. So the more nitrogen available, the more yellow rust the crop is likely to take on. Once the yellow rust is building in crops, it's obviously about monitoring those levels. And then obviously fungicidal intervention. And at that point it's trying to choose the right active or actives, and then the dose rate. The timing of those, and this is where the difference between the juvenile and the adult plant resistance really starts to come in. A lot of growers that I work with and a lot of growers in the area, since the loss of chlorthalonil, which was a very useful active to start a program for septoria, have disappeared, have stopped applying a T0 fungicide. And as the transition into more regenerative farming systems continues, the desire to not apply fungicides, especially at the early stages when the ground is more exposed, especially with actives like strobilurins or azoxystrobin in particular, it's become a big thing not to apply a T0 now. So we need to be aware that some varieties may need special treatment at that stage with something like tebuconazole, because if yellow rust is coming in, that's going to present us with a problem at T1. And relying on T1 as we have over the years, it's been generally fine. in the drier years where we've had these spray windows to get on with, but when we've been caught out with wet weather and T1's been delayed, you've already seen some trial pictures to show the difference that timing makes to disease control. And the year before last, it's fair to say, despite we not having the rain to disrupt us, the wind in our part of the world was unbelievable. We went 3 weeks without a spray day because of wind. And then we look at the actives involved, and the point really, this is Agrii data, the point really I wanted to make here was that of the new chemistry that's come along recently and coming in the future, there's not much bringing activity apart from the new Bayer molecule on yellow and brown rust. If we look at the AHDB's data as well, to make it easier, I've blocked out the other diseases. But similarly to our data, most of the control is coming from 3 key actives. And I put a question mark against tebuconazole. I think my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the decision on its future has been kicked down the road to 2028, but I still think there's a large shroud of uncertainty around the active of whether that will survive the 2028 decision. So I think it's likely it will follow epoxyconazole and disappear, which would be a shame because it's a really cheap and useful active, especially in the early stages for managing yellow rust. And we've at the moment, if tebuconazole, the triazole was to disappear, that would leave us with benzovindoflupyr, the SDHI, pyraclostrobin, the strobilurin, and the new molecule from Bayer. So we would be again relying on a small number of actives to control the disease, which is probably not ideal. So in terms of the UKCPVS, again, a lot of this has already been covered. It's about sending samples in the season, trying to encourage growers to collect and take samples from really badly affected field, or things that I always encourage people to send them if there's something unexpected to what we've seen. So in the past X days would be a good example of that. And then reporting on the data, I thought it was really interesting actually that we saw very, very little yellow rust in my geography, and it sounds like just generally last year, but still 3 new isolates were identified, and it just shows how mobile the population is and how it can change really quickly. And it's important because trying to provide up-to-date information to assist with decision making on farm is so vital in season. The watch list I think is a great idea because it can encourage focus on particular varieties that perhaps wouldn't be at the front of the queue for that. It can help with the fungicide decision making aspect of it, but the biggest part obviously is that planning for that following year after harvest. So what's going to happen for harvest 25, what varieties should we be looking at, how should we try and split them up, rotation, etc. And I've already mentioned this, but I think it's really important that the work continues on looking at the juvenile versus the adult stage. For the last probably 3 or 4 years now, we've noticed that X-Days and Graham, to pick 2 varieties, have been picking up a huge amount of yellow rust in the early stages a lot of the time, and then that's sort of petered out by the time we've got towards T2. But I think it's really, really important trying to understand the difference in the disease at the different growth stages of the crop. So just a bit about how the Agrii R&D data complements that. So what I find really interesting is the tussocks we have across the UK. So there's 12 different sites monitoring. These are very small, couple of metre squared plots with a range of varieties. There's particular focus on obviously what's in the ground from an RL point of view, but also a large number of the commonly used parent material by the breeders at that stage. And it acts as a really useful tool for if there is a varietal breakdown and something starts getting a lot of yellow rust, we can actually try and work out which of the parents that's likely to have originated from. And it's something that's put out to the agronomists through the season, so as a bit like the watch list that's being produced here of varieties to keep an eye on in case they might do something that was a bit unexpected. This is from these some pictures of mine from our wheat trial site in Dorset. So some of the replicated plot work that happens there. So every year, one of the trials that happens is on varieties, and the varieties are picked based on national use, but also on those grown locally. And it's a really interesting exercise for me to have a look at disease levels in the untreated replicates as well as the treated replicates, and this is happening on our iFarm sites around the country, and then that data is being collated and shared by people like Colin's doing a lot of the legwork with that, to be fair, so I'm not going to claim all the credit for doing any of that. But it's a very useful bit of work that happens, so we use that to assist our decision making, especially when we move into planning for that following year. Also, the benchmarking group, from a financial point of view, it's not obviously all about just disease resistance, but benchmarking is a really useful tool, and the MAP group, as it's called, of an Agrii, is a long-standing benchmarking group that's been running for more than 20 years, collating data on varietal performance, and it's a really, really, really useful tool because we can not just look at yields and quality, but we can also look at spend and then work down to a gross margin level on how these varieties are performing. And there's about 100,000 hectares included within that in quite a small geography, because it goes from Oxford down to my area, so that's really, really useful. So just some final thoughts really. This slide was kindly shared with me by Syngenta, and it's just a snapshot in time really. You've got 4 years look, and the data is just showing the number of AIs that are currently approved in those years in the EU. So if you ignore the green, the orange and the lighter blue and just focus on the darker blue on the left, you can see that back in 1993 we had north of 600 AIs approved in the EU, and we've now almost seen a 60% reduction in that. Poxyconazole is obviously gone. I've mentioned tebuconazole already. Further revocations, I believe mancozeb is now the next one to probably disappear, so that will leave us with only the one multi-site in Folpet. Yeah, there is new chemistry on the horizon, which is always positive because we're going to need that new chemistry to help us for sure. But rust control is probably going to get more expensive. In the absence of tebuconazole, I suspect we're going to see rust control programs becoming more like septoria programs in terms of their cost. The increase in regenerative farming and direct drilling is interesting because it's trying to work out exactly what that's going to mean overall, but there's, regardless of whether people are in that system or not, there's generally an effort to try and reduce reliance on synthetic inputs, but even more so within that system. So we need to consider how that's going to impact on disease, especially as lots of those farmers will, regardless of what the disease is doing, will not apply a fungicide when there's not total ground covered from the plant to intercept that fungicide to make sure it doesn't hit the soil. There's definitely, I can't speak for other areas so much, but in my area there's definitely been a move back to Skyfall and a move into X-Days as well, because those two varieties seem to perform exceptionally well in a direct drill scenario, because they get up the ground quickly and seem to get away from slugs, which is one of the most problematic issues we deal with in that kind of system. I think that's quite interesting from a yellow rust point of view, because as you've already heard, Skyfall's the second most susceptible variety currently on the RL list, and X-Days was the most sampled variety last year, and I'm not surprised by that because in the crops I saw there was a huge amount of yellow rust in X-Days, much more than I'd have expected. Earlier drilling, so yeah, one of the issues, if you like, with no-till and regenerative farming is that you need to look to drill earlier in the autumn and later in the spring, which is fine, except there's other issues that I've already mentioned that we're trying to contend with, particularly grass weeds, but also BYDV. So you could argue that an increase in regenerative farming systems and no-till might lead to earlier drilling, thus more septoria, less yellow rust perhaps, but I think that is not going to be quite as straightforward as that, because where people have got serious grass weeds, they're still going to delay drilling. And as I said, until we reach a point where most of the varieties of wheat on the list have BYDV tolerance or resistance, then the BYDV factor is still going to be at play. As I said, there's a desire to reduce reliance on fungicides anyway, so can nutrition play a bigger role? The biologicals, I think it was mentioned at the beginning, I've seen some interesting data that suggests that before the pathogen has established itself in the crop, there's some merit in control from some of those novel biologicals, but I'm yet to be convinced that any of them are providing actually any curative control of yellow rust or other diseases. But it's something that will obviously develop in a developing market. I think, will we see an increase in the later drilling with what's going on? Time will tell. Lots of people talk about the solution is in breeding and increased focus on breeding. There's also a lot of discussion about varietal breakdown, whether there's actually enough genetic variation out there at the moment. Hybrid wheat's already been mentioned as a solution to that. Gene editing's obviously speeding up that process as well. Are we going to see GM now? We're out of the EU. I don't know, but they're all things that might have a significant influence on what happens next. Now, I apologise because this is from 2012, but I've kept it since then because I thought it was such a fantastic graphic by Mike Abraham and some really interesting data that was collected. And this was back in 2012, just looking at how much of the wheat acreage was closely related to Robbergus, which is, you can see why that Robbergus was and continued to be used as a significant part of the breeding program with its decent grain quality, its septoria resistance at the time, and its high yield, but it was also bringing with it some pretty nasty yellow rust weaknesses. These bits of graphic are from NIAB actually, and this is just looking at how varietal split in the ground has altered in the last couple of decades. If I take that and compare it to Agrii seed sales for this autumn, I find it very interesting, not so much the split of the different groups, but of those varieties that make up the top 10 sold varieties this year, those with the considered weakness to yellow rust at the juvenile stage represent more than a third, and those from a brown rust point of view that are below a 5 is more than 40%, which is quite a lot. And it does seem that as the variety's resistance to septoria and yellow rust has improved, it does seem that brown rust and ice spot are the two that seem to be becoming poorer. And this was just me playing around, having a look at parents of those key varieties in there. And I've coloured the ones in red that there's sort of close relation to Robbergus in there, because you'd look at those and they are or are likely at some point in the very near future going to become a real problem variety for yellow rust. And Firefly Illicit already there, Gleam's already there, Zayat's a problem. But it's good that there is some decent diversity there coming through from varieties like Typhoon, which I've not seen any problems in. Dawson will be interesting because there's no yellow rust in it that I've seen thus far, but with such a big acreage in the ground, because of the positive characteristics it's got, it will be interesting to see how long it survives before we start to see a breakdown in that. And likewise with Champion, looks good at the moment, but I would suspect with that reflection in its parentage, that's only a matter of time before we start to see a breakdown in yellow rust in that variety. The orange there was just some of the other parents coming through. So there's a lot of Hereford and Timaru in the parentage of those varieties out there as well. So there's 3 very common parents making up quite a lot of that top 10, top 11 varieties. So where do we go moving forwards? I think as time progresses, it's going to be even more important to have accurate and up-to-date information. A better decision making on farm is only ever going to come from up-to-date, accurate information. It's probably a big ask, and with the science behind it and the timescales involved, but can the UKCPVS provide some detailed in-season updates to assist with what's happening, where the samples are coming in much earlier in the winter and the very, very early spring? Is there the opportunity to provide some in-season data of what's going on to give people a heads up? And is there an opportunity there for improved cross-industry partnerships, so sharing of information to increase the level of data available to advisors and growers? And that's me. Thank you. Questions now at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Todd, for that very wide-ranging and holistic approach, which I think illustrates very well the balancing act that growers have to be involved with. I think as a plant pathologist, I've always known that if you control one disease, you sometimes exacerbate problems with another. I think, to be fair to you, you ought to have a couple of questions.
Okay. There are any?
Do we have any questions here? I think everyone's probably... I mean, you haven't said a great deal about the regenerative agriculture thing. I mean, how common now is no-till?
I think it's disproportionately more common in my area because of the soil type, because it's a lot of chalk over free draining chalk soils based over limestone, so it's very free draining, it's easier to work. It's probably north of 60% of the acreage I see now, increasing. I suspect it will be more like 70% by the time we get to next autumn. And now there's another SFI option been launched, no-till for £73 a hectare or whatever it is. So that's obviously going to drive no-till and into that farming system more, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's only increasing, and you see now, you only have to turn on the television, you hear people using the terminology, whether you like it or loathe it. It's McCain's and Nestle, and the end users are going to start driving it now as well, aren't they?
Mm.
So it's going to grow
Watch
quite
this
quickly.
space.
Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
I suppose a final one from that then will be the aspect about BYDV. And I know you mentioned it, but you didn't highlight maybe as one of the final thoughts. Just wondering where your thoughts would be on that, given that in the no-till situation, presumably it will be pushed earlier.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people in those situation, they see it as almost the holy grail. If we can get a variety that has a growth habit like Skyfall with decent disease resistance, decent yield, if we can ask for everything, but that's also BYDV tolerant or resistant, even better, then great. Yeah.